rainy, but if you're at home all curled up, why let's spend some time in God's Word. Welcome to Christ Community Bible Church. This is our equipping hour, and we have been studying the book of Genesis. And just last week we saw the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and of course Lot and his family escaped. Lot's wife didn't want to leave, and so she turned to look back, and God's judgment fell on her also. And remember, the last thing that happened is that the angels told Lot that they wanted him to flee to the mountains. They said, we're going to bring great destruction on this area, and we want you to flee to the mountains. And God and Lot said, please, not that. He had become, I think, a city guy. And so he said, at least let me go to this little town. There was a small town among those cities there that were being destroyed. It's called Zoar, Z-O-A-R. And he said, let me go to Zoar instead of going to the mountains. Just to refresh you here on the basic geography. So here's the Holy Land, here's the Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, and Dead Sea. Here's the Mediterranean over here. And this is the Tigris and Euphrates, where Abram originally came from. Okay, so where is this Sodom and Gomorrah stuff? If you look down at the bottom of the Dead Sea, again, we're not sure exactly. I mean, when God destroys a place, he does a good job of it. And so we're not sure right now exactly, but the closest archaeologists can come on this is that Sodom and Gomorrah were down here to the at the bottom of the Dead Sea and just a little bit on the western side. Zoar would have been just a little bit to the east of that. So the angel said, flee to the mountains because God's going to destroy this whole area. And Lot said, no, please no. Let me go to the city instead. And they said, okay, we will not destroy it because of you. And so Lot flees to Zoar. Well, let's pick it up then in chapter 19. And we'll pick it up with verse 29. So we're in Genesis 19, verse 29. I'll let you get there. Okay, verse 29 of 19 says, thus it came about when God destroyed the cities of the valley, that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out in the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot lived. That what God says that what's God remember? Why is God relenting? Not because of Lot, but because of Abraham. Remember, Abraham had prayed an intercessory prayer for his nephew Lot. And the reason that God's letting up is because of the prayer that Abraham prayed. And it said, God remembered Abraham and sent. Okay, verse 30. Lot went up from Zoar and stayed in the mountains. Now that sounds a little weird considering what we've just been talking about. Remember, Lot was told to go to the mountains and he wanted to go to Zoar instead. Now we find in this chapter, in this verse, verse 30, Lot went up from Zoar and stayed in the mountains. Why is that? He didn't want to go to Zoar. He wanted to go to the mountains. Now he's leaving Zoar and going to the mountains. Why? Well, this is another one of those things where the Bible does not tell us exactly why that was. We can kind of do some speculation of some things that may be true. We know that Lot did go to Zoar because the angel said, until you go into Zoar, we cannot begin the destruction process of these other cities. So Lot went into Zoar. Did the people there turn on him? Did they figure that, that this is Lot's God who had destroyed the other cities? Did they turn on him and his family? We don't know. But whatever it was, Lot had made a big deal about, no, not the mountains, let me go to this city. So he goes to the city, and then for whatever reason, he leaves the city and does what he had been asked to do in the first place, which is to go to the mountains. These mountains, there are mountains around the Dead Sea, caves in those mountains. In fact, you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These were found in the caves surrounding the Dead Sea. And so Lot is there. Remember that Lot was a wealthy man. He had flocks and herds and servants and a lot of money. We don't know what Lot managed to get away with. Whether there was a little bit of money, he carried a bag of it or whatever. We don't know what God he left with. But we know that just days before, he is one of the wealthiest men in the area, and now he has practically nothing. And he's living in a cave. His sons didn't leave. His daughters didn't leave. The two unmarried daughters did leave with him. His wife was turned into a pillar of salt when she kept looking back and she was regretting having to leave. And so God's judgment came on her. So what it comes down to is Lot and his two daughters, minus the flocks, minus the herds, minus the money, minus the house, minus everything. And now Lot is living with his daughters in a cave in the mountains. Obviously, he had lost pretty much everything. Now, his daughters now got concerned. Now, remember, one of the things that we can figure at this point is they did not know the extent of the destruction. Like, they knew that, they could see, in fact, Abraham, who lived like right up in this area right here, he could look down and see the destruction. It said that he went out and he saw the smoke rising up from the cities. God sent fire and brimstone into the cities. We don't know where that came from. Did it come from some, scientists have said maybe there was some sort of comet explosion or something like that. Probably, I think the best explanation is fire and brimstone out of heaven. The God who made the world can certainly do that. Whatever it was, it burned. It was like almost like a nuclear explosion. It totally destroyed the cities. A lot of cities were destroyed in those days for various things, and we can go back now and find the sort of the remnants of those. And they think they found the areas in which these were. And I think I mentioned last week that there's rocks with a really high, and brimstone is a sort of a sulfur derivative, and they found that rocks with such a high sulfur content that you can put a cigarette lighter on them and they burn even today. And there's some structures they say this could have been the remnants of a city, but we're not sure. God just totally wiped this area off the face of the earth. So bad that Abraham could see it up where he was living. They did not know down here, I would imagine, because they didn't. The angels didn't tell them how extensive was the destruction. So, obviously they knew that all the cities that they were familiar with were gone, except for that one city of Zoar. Had God destroyed pretty much everything? They didn't know. But now the daughters of Lot get concerned about, well, we had, we would have certainly been betrothed had we stayed in Sodom. Now we're gone. Will we ever get married? Will we ever have children? And so they were frustrated at that. They didn't know where they would go. The obvious thing is Zoar. the one that they just left, and there were men in Zoar, which one of the things that makes us think that maybe there was some kind of falling out between Lot and the people of Zoar, so that in effect they were kicked out. Because that's the obvious thing. They were close to Zoar. They knew that Zoar hadn't been destroyed. So if they're concerned about, will we ever be married? Will we ever have husbands? Will we ever have children? That's kind of the logical place for that to come. But for whatever reason, they thought that that was not a possibility, and they didn't know beyond that what other cities there were. And so they began to think, what can we do to make sure that we ultimately have children? This is one of the really sordid stories of the Old Testament. And one of the reasons we know that, God never hid that stuff from us. God never hesitated to tell us the truth about what people in that day were doing, even people who were his people. And so what we find here is that they concoct a scheme so that they can end up with children. And so look and see what they did. Verse 32, they said, "Come, let us make our father drink wine, and let us lie with him, that we may preserve our family through our father." One of the things I was thinking about is where'd they come up with the wine? I don't know whether Lot had, he could have brought maybe a few things with him, just what he could carry. Did he bring wine? Or did they get wine when they were in Zoar? Did he have a little bit of money and could get wine? Whatever it is, there was wine in the cave. And they just didn't answer the question about where that came from. So, verse 33, so they made their father drink wine that night. And the firstborn went in and lay with her father. And he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Lot would never have done this sober. And they knew. So they got their father drunk. So drunk that they could seduce him. And they had one after the other had sex with our father. Verse 34. On the following day, the firstborn said to the younger, "Behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. And when you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve our family through our father." So they made the father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. As for the younger, she also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the sons of Ammon to this day. And so they had sex with their father, who was drunk. Obviously, Lot could take his daughters out of Sodom, but he couldn't take Sodom out of his daughters. And his daughters figured out how they could do this with their father. Some people, are concerned about, like, we know that there are prohibitions, scriptural and even legal, now against sex with your father and things like that. Remember that in this day, they are a lot closer to Adam and Eve. They are much closer to the beginning. And so what we find is, over a period of time, there's a degeneration in the human race. So that originally these people were perfect. There were no genetic abnormalities in Adam and Eve, or the children even of Adam and Eve. They were perfectly healthy. Every bit of mutation, abnormality, gene defect and everything, that was all introduced later on into the gene pool. And so they were living, obviously, in those days. Adam lived into his 900s. A lot of these early patriarchs lived into the 700s, 800s, 900s. And so we find their body, and also They walked everywhere they went, obviously. They ate, they were vegetarians in the early days. And then after they ate meat, there was none of the kinds of things that we eat today that are bad for our bodies. So we have an inherited excellent body without some of the problems that got introduced into the bloodline later on. We've got people who are eating clean and living clean and walking a lot and everything like that. Plus, God is just blessing them in those days with that longevity. The longevity is beginning to cut back with Abraham and his children. Abraham lived to the age of 175. Which by kind of standards of the day, almost for the few hundred years before that, that was almost dying young, because now after the flood, the lifespans began to decline. But again, because of the bodies the way they were in those days, etc. This was certainly not right what they did, but they didn't have to worry about the kind of genetic defects and everything like that that we would in sleeping with a parent. Notice they had two children. They had one was the father of the Moabites, the other of the Ammonites. And so they were going to live down here in this area, south of the Red Sea, and these were perpetual enemies of Israel. Again, Abraham is the father of the nation Israel. Abraham's son Isaac, son Jacob. Jacob's name changed to Israel. So the Jewish people today are descended from Abraham. All of them. That's where the nation was born, with Abraham. But when they went into the wilderness, went into Egypt several hundred years later, and then came back, some of the nations that they had problems with, that were perpetual thorns in their sides that they had to fight, etc., were the Moabites and the Ammonites. Probably the most famous Moabite person, though, is Ruth later on. And Ruth was a Moabitess, and she became a part of the bloodline of Christ. So Ruth and Boaz were married. A couple of generations later comes Jesse, and out of Jesse comes David. So, but nevertheless, they were enemies. You will find as you read the Old Testament, perpetual enemies of Israel, fighting a lot of battles, wars, etc., with Israel and with Judah in the divided kingdom. You will find the Moabites and the Ammonites. And the Moabites and the Ammonites were descendants of Lot. All right, so we are now in chapter 20. Remember that as we look at Bible history, there's two things going on here. One is there's the historical record, which tells us where things came from, where traditions started, how the nation got started, where peoples came from, like the Moabites and the Ammonites, and etc. And so there's a lot of history that helps us to put things into context. But there's also this overarching thing about what God is doing. What is God's big plan? And we know that God's big plan, at first is saying, well, God's big plan is to call out Abraham and to make a nation out of him, to give him those three things: land, seed, and blessing. I'll give you this land where I send you, the promised land, Canaan. I'm going to give you that. I'm going to give you seed. Right now you are childless, but I'm going to give you children. And I will give you a blessing. I will make sure that I will bless you, and people who bless you, I will bless. And people who curse you and fight you, then I will be against those people. Land, seed, and blessing. So that's the big picture. But there was a picture beyond that too. What was God trying to do in Abram's life? Trying to give him a son, but more than that, what's he trying to do? He's trying to build faith in Abram's life. He's trying to help Abraham grow into a man of faith and an example of faith, so that by the time you get to the New Testament, Abraham could be called in several places the father of faith. That is the one thing. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing if people ask when they think of you, what one thing do they think of? Well, with Abraham, even now, when you think of Abraham, when you think of a character quality, what is it? It's always faith. And so God is trying to build faith in Abraham's life. And he always does it in two ways. There's two ways to build faith. Still, two ways to build faith. Number one, God has to show you what it is he wants from you, what he wants you to do, what he wants to do for you. He shows you that. Faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word of God. There's got to be a content for the faith. And for Abraham, the content was, I am God. I plan to do these things for you. I plan to give you a land. I will give you seed. I will give you blessing. All these things. I called you out of Ur, which is over here next to the Tigris Euphrates. I called you into this land. Walk around, look at it. Everything you see, I plan to give to you. So that's the content. And God said a big part of that will be the fact that even though you are childless and Sarah, your wife, is barren, I will give you children. I will give you a seed. And ultimately, not only will that seed be the beginning of a nation, but that seed will be a blessing to everyone, because Jesus Christ comes, obviously, in the heritage, in the lineage of Abraham. You trace Jesus back far enough, goes back to Abraham. And so that's what God's trying to do. That's the content of the faith. But now, does God build faith in me? Does God build faith in you? Does God build faith in Abraham by telling him what he plans to do? Here are the rules. Here are the principles. Here's what I want you to know. Here's what I want you to believe. Does that build faith? No, not at all. Faith is built when you have revelation, and then that revelation is tested to see if you will believe. If you're trying to build muscles at the gym, what do? Do you go down and read all the books, watch all the videos, tour all the equipment, see everything at the gym? Does that build does that build muscle? No, not at all. It's only when you begin to work out. It's only begin when those muscles that you have are tested, and you have to lift and strain and pull and push and use the various muscles that you have, that those muscles get stronger and stronger. How does God build faith? He tells us something. He gives us a principle. He tells us about himself. I mean, it can be a very basic thing like, I love you and you're my child. Oddly enough, that's something a lot of people have trouble with, is saying that, I am a child of God. God loves me. And even when I don't feel that love or experience that love, it seems that I can feel or sense. And even when I feel dirty and unforgiven, I am still God's child. And God says, I love you no matter how you feel. Even though it feels like I don't, I do. And so that's the way God builds faith. That's the way God built it with Abraham. How long was it from the time when God said, I will give you a son, and the son will be Sarah's son? How long was it from then until ultimately Isaac was born? 25 years. For 25 years, Abraham saw no evidence that God was at work. I mean, he saw God work in other things. He saw God's blessing in many areas. He saw answered prayer in many areas. But in that one thing that he wanted so much, child, the one thing that God had promised him, he saw none of that. And so for 25 years, God had said, I'm going to give you a child, and then came back later and said, yeah, I'm going to do it. And so, but Abraham saw nothing. He decided to help God out. So he and Sarah cooked up this deal where Sarah gave him her maid as a wife. And so Abraham had a child with her and said, okay, this is it. We have had God's child. And God says, no, that's not the one I told you about. I'm going to do what I promised you. Yeah, you went out and had a child, but that's not the child I promised you. And so God keeps putting Abraham, now his name is changed now. He puts Abraham into situations where his faith is tested. One of the first times when Abraham first got into the land, again, he's nomadic. He's wandering around. God has told him, I'm not going to give you a city yet. I'm not going to give you a place. Check it out. Look at everything in the land. But as of yet, I'm not giving it to you. In fact, later on, he really explained that. He said, you will wander around. You'll be nomadic. In fact, later on, your children will do that too. And then later on, your people will go into captivity in Egypt, and then I'll bring them out. And when I bring them out, I'll give them the land. But we're looking at hundreds of years from now, Abraham. And so one of the things Abraham did early was he headed down to Egypt. When he got to the land, there was a famine in the land. He's sort of like, yeah, God put me here. God told me to come here. But obviously, God didn't realize that there was going to be a famine. God was trying to teach him to trust. But Abraham didn't do that. So he went down here. He lied about his wife because his wife, even though she was aged at the time, was a beautiful woman. And Abraham didn't want to be killed because of her. And so Pharaoh took his wife. And God cursed Pharaoh's house, and Pharaoh ended up giving Sarah back, giving Abraham flocks and herds and money and everything like that, and sends him away. But this was a test of faith, and Abraham failed it. Now let's fast forward 20 years. It's a rerun. What has Abraham learned in 20 years? In this area, not much. You know, sometimes there are sins that we commit, and we get victory over those sins, and we feel like we're growing in those areas. And there are areas of weakness in our old nature that certain things, it just seems like this sin, over here I can see growth, and over here I can see blessing, and over here I can see obedience, but over here, this gives me such a hard time, and I keep getting defeated. And obviously, one of the things that Abraham's area of weakness was in this area of his personal safety when it came to Sarah. Because it was very common, especially when you were nomadic. See, Abraham kept moving around. It wasn't that things kept changing around him. It's that he moved into new areas, and when he did, it was very common in those days. There's somebody new in the area, and the rulers would check them out, and if there were people there that were beautiful women that the ruler wanted to add to the harem, then he would pay a price, or if they seem unwilling to do that, they might even kill the people who were involved and take the women for themselves. And so this happened in Egypt. 20 years later, it's going to happen again. Now, it's going to happen, the place where it happens is called Gerar. And if you look at over here, this area here is the area that we later came to call Judah, Israel. And then Israel divided up into Israel on top and Judah on the bottom. And over here on the coastline, there was another nation, and again, it's one of those nations that Israel always had problems with, and it was called Philistia, the Philistines. And so the Philistines were over here on the coast. They weren't here yet. They arrived later on, actually, when Israel was in Egypt. But there was one country over here in the land that we would later call the land of the Philistines. There was one city over here, a city-state probably. It's called Gerar, G-E-R-A-R. And there was a king there who was called Abimelech. We don't know whether Abimelech, probably not the king's name. It was probably the title of the king there. You know, like Pharaoh was not a person. There was no dude named Pharaoh. Pharaoh was a title. Caesar, even though some Roman rulers took it as theirs, like Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, etc., they took that name, but Caesar was a title, like president now is a title. So Abimelech was probably a title. So Abraham is moving around. He moves over here in this more like coastal area, and there's a place called Gerar, and it's ruled over by a guy named Abimelech. Let's look at what happens. Verse 1 of chapter 20. Now Abraham journeyed from there toward the land of the Negev and settled between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. Abraham said of Sarah his wife, "She is my sister." Now remember, he had said the same thing in Egypt, and technically she is, because Abraham's father was named Terah, and Terah had, we don't know how many wives, at least two, probably many more than that. And so Abraham was Terah's son by one of those wives. By another wife, Sarah was born. So Abraham and Sarah were half brother and sister. Both had the same, they had different mothers, but the same father. And so they had cooked up, and we see actually in this story, and we'll read it and won't stop again, but we see that all the way back to before they ever came into the land, Abraham had cooked up this story with Sarah, because Abraham was afraid before they ever came into the land. We're going into some place that's new and different. We'll be around a lot of people we don't know. We'll be around rulers, and you know how those people are. I mean, they see us coming into the land, and they'll see how beautiful you are, and they'll want to kill me to take you away. So let's do this, so I won't get killed. Because if she is his sister, then if anything, they will pay him for her, or they will take her. But if she is his wife, then they might kill him to get her. And so they cook up this thing, and Abraham said, and Sarah goes along with it. I mean, this was a situation of obeying her husband and not really trusting her husband to do the best thing, because he didn't, but trusting God, I think, to work things out rather than trusting her husband. Her obedience was to Abraham, but her trust was in God, that God would work things out. But again, this was all worked out before they ever came into the land. And so when they got to Egypt, they already had the strategy. Here's what we're going to do if we get into the situation that one of the nobles or one of the agents of the king shows up and says, "We want you. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to say, this is my sister, and you go along with it," okay? verse 2, Abraham said of his wife, she is my sister. So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream that night and said to him, and this is one of my favorite verses in the Old Testament. You know, if you got verses that you love, this is one of the ones I love, because Abraham, God comes to him and says this famous phrase, behold, you're a dead man. And that's quite a way to wake up, or quite something to come to you in your dream, because Abimelech goes and gets this woman. Abraham said, this is my sister. Abimelech takes her. Maybe there was probably some price that was to be paid at that point for her. Abimelech gets a beautiful new woman. And by the way, how old was the beautiful new woman? She was 90. And yet there was, she was obvious. In fact, even rabbinical tradition tells us that, that Sarah was one of the most beautiful women of the ancient Near East. And so obviously, even with her age, he wanted her. Now, when they took them into the harem, it's not like they took them in and, you know, began sleeping with them. There was frequently a rite of purification that would go on when they entered the harem. There were beauty regimens and things like that. We see that in Esther later on, when Esther is taken into the Persian king's harem. Before she would ever sleep with a king, there was this thing that she went through, probably learning the traditions, maybe learning some of the language. Certainly, women, if you can imagine going to a day spa where they pamper you all day and bathe you and massage you and work on makeup and things like that. And that's exactly what they did. So Sarah, it's pretty cool for her. She was undergoing all that, but as yet she had not gone in to sleep with the king. And so God comes to Abimelech and says, Abimelech, dude, you're as good as dead, because of the woman you've taken, for she is married. Now Abimelech had not come near her. And he said, Lord, will you slay a nation, even though blameless? Did not he himself say to me, as Abraham, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I've done this. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that in the integrity of your heart you have done this. And I've also kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now, therefore, restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not restore her, know that you will surely die, you and all that are yours. A couple things here. God is protecting Sarah. God is protecting this seed line. Now, remember, Sarah is going to become the great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother of Jesus Christ. This is Abram and Sarah are the seed line of the Messiah. And you can ultimately see even the work of the enemy behind this, because if Abraham loses Sarah, and Sarah becomes a part of this heathen king's harem, then the whole plan of God to call out a nation that will be the progeny of Abraham and Sarah, then all of that is ruined. And so God is protecting Sarah. Even though Abraham did not protect her, even though Abraham did not trust God, even though when Abraham had not done that before, and he had you would think he would have perhaps learned a lesson. I mean, the story is the same. What happened was what happened with Abimelech in Gerar, what happened with Pharaoh, and it was the exact same thing. And 20 years have passed, and Abraham still has not learned. He makes the same mistake. And it's interesting that God, in talking about Abraham, the man who has screwed it up again. And God, this is after the Abrahamic covenant. It's after God appears to Abraham. And they do this covenant where he puts Abraham to sleep, and God passes through the parts of the animal, and God says, here's what I'm going to do for you. After all of this, and God has appeared to Abraham. Remember, just in the chapter before, these two angels and God himself come to Abraham, and Abraham is negotiating with God over Sodom. And yet in this situation, when God is not where Abraham can see him, and Abraham is in a situation where it looks like his life might be threatened, Abraham wimps out and doesn't trust God, and instead lies about his sister. And notice what God does. I mean, you just be tempted to think, he's blown it and blown it and blown it. This man's not going to cut it. And when God comes to Abimelech, what does God say in that dream to Abimelech? He is a prophet, and he will pray for you. Abraham has sinned and forgotten God and not trusted God. And God comes to this man who's blown it again. And I think if we were God in that situation, then we would say, I've given you chance after chance after chance over decades, and you keep messing it up. I'm going to start again. And all God says about Abraham when he comes to Abimelech is, he's a prophet. He'll pray for you. Because God's not through with Abraham, just like he's not through with us. Abimelech rose early in the morning, verse 8, and called his servants and told these things in their hearing. And the men were greatly frightened. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you that you have brought on me and my kingdom this great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to have been done. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what have you encountered that you have done this thing? And Abraham said, what a wimp. Because I thought, surely there's no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is actually my sister, the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. And she became my wife. In other words, Abimelech, I really wasn't lying to you exactly. I mean, she is sort of my sister. She's not my sister, but she's my half-sister. That should count for something. And it came about when God caused me to wander from my father's house. Oh, it's sort of like, almost like this is kind of God's fault. Saying, don't be mad at me, Abimelech, because she's sort of my sister, and I'm even here because God sent me out, etc. That's why I said to her, this is the kindness that you will show to me. See, they had worked this thing out, as I said, back before they ever, either before they ever left Ur, or at least before they left Haran, as they were leaving. This is the kindness that you will show to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother. Then Abimelech, notice that God, even though Abraham has failed, and failed again. Some people say, it's easy, I understand, Abraham messed up in Egypt and everything like that. But this is 20 years later, and Abraham should know better. And yet, God is forgiving, and God says, what I told you is true. I've still got my hand on you. And notice what happens. After Abraham has messed up, what happens? He gets richer. Notice what he said. Abimelech, verse 14, then took sheep and oxen and male and female servants and gave them to Abraham and restored his wife Sarah to him. Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you. Settle wherever you please. To Sarah he said, behold, I have given your brother. I love this, not your husband. I've given your brother. He didn't even count him as his husband. You know, time when we mess up, our witness in the world is pretty messed up too. You know, and will Abimelech ever? I mean, he knew he had to ask Abraham to pray for him and everything like that. Did Abimelech respect Abraham as a man of God? I don't think so. You know, and in fact, even when he's telling Sarah here, when he's giving these instructions, he doesn't even say, "I told you." He said, "I told your brother. I've given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver, and behold, it is your vindication before all who are with you, and before all the men that you are cleared." In other words, the fact that I've given him that money shows that you did nothing wrong. Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his maids so that they bore children. One of the things that God had done is obviously he had closed the wombs of all of Abimelech's harem, all of his wives, etc. And now God restored that function to them. He says he healed them so that they bore children. For Yahweh had closed fast all the wombs of the household of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So God blessed Abraham despite his sin. And so we see here that God is building faith in Abraham. And sometimes he passes wonderfully. Sometimes he fails. Sometimes he fails and then he fails again. And it looks like he's not growing, but he is. And Abraham, this man that went and wimped out, lied about Sarah again. This is the same man that in the New Testament it says he is the father of faith. Because God's got a plan to build faith. And the only way he can build it is, number one, to reveal his truth. And number two, to test it in our lives. Because as long as we can see God and what he's doing, that's not faith. The only way that God can build faith is to put us in a situation where we can't see him and we can't sense his presence and we can't see his power, and we must obey even then. What would have happened had Abram gone in and said, you know, I made this mistake 20 years ago. I messed up. And it looks like a dangerous situation, but I'm not going to lie about my wife. And I'm going to trust God to take. That speeds up what can. So he messed up. He blew it. And yet even then, God is faithful because God says, you're my child. And you're the one I've chosen. And I'm going to work this out with you. Chapter 21. Let's move on. We got just a few minutes, but we can finish with the birth of Isaac. Now, at this point, Abraham is 100, and Sarah is 90. The original promise of the birth of Isaac came 25 years beforehand. And God has not done it yet. Often there is a time gap between the time that God promises something, the time that we know there's something God wants to do, and the time that that he performs it. He makes it happen. And God is not teasing us. He's teaching us. Because again, he realized, again, the big plan and what Abraham is thinking about, it's all about the son. It's all about the seed. It's all about the child from Sarah. That's the big deal. And it was a big deal. But again, that's not what it's all about for God. Yeah, it is about the son. It's about the seed. It's about the coming of Isaac. But more than that, it's about building faith in Abraham. About saying, here's what I'm going to do. And Abraham looking around and saying, I don't see it. I still don't see it. I've waited 10 years and I don't see it. I've waited 20 years and I don't see it. And yet, God is right on time, as always. Verse 1. Then Yahweh took note of Sarah as he had said, and Yahweh did for Sarah as he had promised. Isn't that a beautiful verse? Yahweh took note of Sarah as he had said, and Yahweh did for Sarah as he had promised. So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time which God had spoken to him. In other words, God's right on time. God hasn't delayed it. God hasn't put it off. When God told Abraham, I'm going to give you a son, and the son will be Sarah's, and even though she's barren, I'm going to give you this son. This was the time that God had planned to do that. God knew that there would be a delay between the time he promised it and the time he fulfilled it, because God's working two things out at the same time. Number one, he's working out the seed line. But number two, he's working out Abraham. He's building Abraham. Okay, so verse 3. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, to whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Then Sarah circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old. By the way, this is the first child in Scripture that's circumcised at 8 days. This is the time they're supposed to be circumcised. But earlier, when God had given them the covenant and said, this is the circumcision is the sign of the covenant. Remember, Abraham circumcised himself and everyone in his house. But they were all adult men or older. This is the first child that is born as a baby and then is circumcised at 8 days old. Verse 5. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has made laughter for me, and everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? 90 years old. The first time that God had given that promise, remember Sarah was hiding in the tent and she overheard it. She laughed, and it was a laugh of like, this can't happen. But now it's a laugh of joy. And she says, I mean, isn't that great? That that there are times when God just makes you so happy. You just laugh. I mean, it's so good, It's one thing to enter into the truth of it, but it's another thing to experience the good of it. And she said, this is joy. Because at age 90, I've had this child. And I love what she says here at the very end of verse 7. And it says, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children, and yet I have borne him a son in his old age? Well, she was 90, and there was a age issue there with her. But notice she said, my poor old husband Abraham, I have borne him a son. Yeah, so she's 90, and he is 100. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. Well, the next thing we're going into, and we are, just to let you know how the class is working out, we're going to go through Abraham this semester, meaning ending up right before Christmas. So we'll be back same time, same channel next Sunday, and we'll be ending up or at least getting very close to the end of life of Abraham. One of the most important chapters in Scripture is Genesis 22. It's referred to many times in the New Testament. Genesis 22 is the sacrifice of Isaac. And so now we see in 22, we see that sacrifice occurring. So we're going to do that next week. There's something we've got to do before we get to that about Hagar and Ishmael, but we'll do that at the end of 21, and then we'll go into this crucially important chapter, Genesis 22, next week. Let's pray together. Father, thank you so much for what you've taught us today. Thank you that we know that you're working in our lives just like you were in Abraham's life. We know that more than anything, you want to develop faith in us. And the only way you can do that is to reveal your truth in your word, and then to test that truth and ask us to believe it when we don't see it or sense it or feel it, when we see no evidence of your activity, to believe you're there anyway, and it's our job to obey. Thank you so much for this time together, Father. Take your truth and bless it to our lives this week. In Jesus' name, amen.